Today we read from Proverbs chapter 23, verse 10. Do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together these two verses 10 and 11. In this chapter, it gives us various instructions. First of all, in the form of do not do particular things, but later some positive statements. And these demonstrate the general principle of God's instructions. When God says do not do something, it's not just because he doesn't want us to do it. It's because it has bad consequences for us, both in this life and in the life to come. Conversely, godliness, doing things God's way, has benefits in this life and in the life to come. These are not rules in exactly the same sense as the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not, but rather they are reasonings pointing out the consequences of the actions. So, verse 9 said, do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. And we saw that a fool was the person who says there is no God. And to speak in the positive sense of trying to persuade him that there is a God. Despite this wisdom from Solomon, there are occasions when we will speak in the hearing of a fool. The penalty for doing so is not consignment to hell, but the fact that he will despise the wisdom of your words. And so understand that when we share the gospel, we will upset some people. Indeed, when Jesus came to speak the truth, he ended up being crucified, and he calls us to follow him. Nevertheless, we must understand that to be on the Lord's side, we are taking a stand against Satan, and he will be opposed to us. And those who are on his side will despise us. Well, verse 10 and 11 then says, do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. In the former proverb, it was the fools who would despise us. But in this proverb, it is God who will oppose us. We read in Genesis chapter 10 that the earth was divided in the days of Peleg. This was the time when boundaries were set between nations and people groups. And the New Testament tells us that God has allocated particular areas of country to particular families, we would call them. Now we would call them nations. And God has established the kingdoms of the world and the times of their habitation. So that if we go about changing, first of all at a national level, and then, of course, on a personal level, these boundaries, we are challenging people that we should respect, decisions that have been made in the past. And we need to have a very strong, good reason, not just our own advantage. James explains, why do wars take place among us? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and war, yet you do not have, because you do not ask. And you ask and do not receive, because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. But that's not God's way. God has allocated things. We are to be at peace and to accept the rulings of the past and build our lives on them, not to try and reinvent the past. The ancient landmarks are not just boundaries of countries or boundaries of properties, but there are moral and social landmarks as well. For the very institution of marriage was created by God with the two first people. But those who want to redefine what is normal, what is standard, what is acceptable, are changing ancient landmarks. Now he says, do not enter the fields of the fatherless. The opportunity to change a landmark is when you find some land that maybe becomes an easy target. Here, the field of the fatherless. The man has died. There is no one currently looking after the property. And rather than support the family that is left to help them get back on their feet, which is God's way, you say, I can now take over that land because the present owners can't defend it. Well, you are going against God. God gave that family that land. There's a king that we read a lot about in the Old Testament called Ahab. His father decided to build a new capital city called Samaria. It was a greenfield site, and they built the city. As the city grew, Ahab looked over the fence and saw his neighbour Naboth, and he thought, I would like that land for my vegetable garden. So he went to Naboth and asked to buy the land. But Naboth said, this land has been in my family for 800 years. It had been the family heritage since the Israelites had come into the land in the time of Joshua. It was their land, and he wanted to maintain it. And it was his right. It was an ancient landmark, an ancient boundary. Ahab had no respect for these ancient boundaries. He wanted his vegetable garden close by so that he could get fresh vegetables every day. And he was very upset that Naboth did not respect him enough to sell him the land. But his wife, she said, well, we can deal with this. You are the king, after all. She instructed the elders of the city to call a public meeting, a dinner, a feast, and organised for Naboth to be there, but organised for false accusers to sit opposite him and to start accusing him of blaspheming God, with the intention that he should be stoned. And her scheme worked out. Naboth was stoned, and Jezebel said, now go and take his land, for now it was the field of the fatherless. But God knew what he had done, and God brought vengeance on Ahab and his family, on Jezebel and on that city. It wasn't immediate, but it happened. Ahab himself dying in battle, and ultimately all of his family was wiped out by God's judgment. For the Redeemer is mighty, and he will plead their cause against you. Since men began to multiply on the earth after the flood, since the time of Abraham, nations have gone to war against nations, to take their wealth, take their land, take control of their resources. God has used some of these battles to discipline nations who have forgotten him. But it is the Lord who has established the boundaries for the habitation of people. The so-called First Nations, Aborigines, natives, need to be respected in their land and not have the land taken from them. This fact is behind Aboriginal land claims. They were here. The ancient boundary gave Australia to these people, and although they may be weak compared to the power of Europe, yet God is on their side. And 100 years ago, some proud people were saying that these people would cease to exist because we were genetically superior. But it's not a matter of genetic superiority. They also are descendants of Noah. It's a fact that their Redeemer is mighty, and he will plead their cause against you. And in every area where God has established a pattern, we are to respect the pattern and plan that God has established. For we all will stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of what we have done. Those who sow to the flesh will reap corruption. Those who sow to the Spirit will reap everlasting life.